Howdy! Can you hear me now better? Yeah. Sorry, my voice always kind of softer range. Welcome. Thank you so much for coming to our last laser talk in this semester. We're so excited to have you here with the amazing speaker today. My name is Hwa-Young Seo, a director for Institute for Applied Creativity. We're so happy to have you here, and also we appreciate supports from, I have to remember all the names, but College of PBFA and IAC, Glasscock Digital Center for Digital Humanity. Close enough, right? Thank you so much, and then Nalini is going to introduce the speaker.
Thank you, Hwa-Young. My name is Lynn Vartan. Many of you know me. It's such a pleasure to be welcoming you to our last laser lecture of this season, our inaugural season. The laser lecture series is in part from Leonardo Publications, which is an international organization where campuses and institutions can host interdisciplinary talks in the spirit of Da Vinci. So we are currently a laser host and hope to continue in the future. It's my great pleasure to give you a little bit of an introduction to our guest. I was able to meet Dr. Nadkarni in Utah in another lecture series and was so impressed by the breadth and depth of her work and so inspired by all the things that she is doing that when we started this talk series, I thought, oh, this would just be the perfect person to bring it home for the series. She really exemplifies that merging of arts, sciences, research, care for humanity, care for the globe, and so much more. So it is with great pride I introduce you to Dr. Nalini Nadkarni.
Thanks, Lynn. Thanks, everyone, for being here. I'm really happy to present to an interdisciplinary group coming from University of Utah, which is a very siloed traditional place. It's really wonderful to know that all of your minds are open to different ways of knowing. And I think that interdisciplinary approach to solving problems and understanding our world is really most important now with the complex social and ecological problems that we find ourselves on. And I think, I don't know about you, but I know I very often feel in these times that we're really walking a knife edge between despair and hope. And if we fall too far on the side of hope, then I think, well, somebody else will take care of it and I'll be fine. And if we fall too much on the side of despair, we are immobilized and we don't do anything. And so I think that disturbances in our lives and on our planets and in our work often lead us to being on this knife edge. And when you think of the word disturbance, the definition is the interruption of a state of peace, of quiet, or calm. And our language really reflects this negative aspect, the horrific earthquake, or the horrible volcanic reaction, or the terrible political situation, or the tragic car accident. So I think we tend to push disturbance to the side to deny it, or to sort of pretend it's not there. But it is ubiquitous and it is unpredictable. And I'd like to talk today about my thoughts on how disturbance can also be generative and creative, occurring in our individual lives and in our work and on our planet. And I think that a lot of this comes from my own perspective as a forest ecologist. I spent the last 40 years documenting the ecology and biota that live in the treetops in the complex tapestry of tropical and temperate rainforests. I've also studied the effects not only in primary and undisturbed forests, but also tried to understand the effects of disturbance on forests and how they work. So what I'd like to do is to talk about, first a little bit about forest canopy ecology, because I think it reflects on this idea of disturbance as a generative process. Secondly, I'll talk about some of the interdisciplinary insights and exchanges I've had to better understand the effect of disturbances on system. And finally, I'll talk about some of the application of the precepts that have come out of that interdisciplinary work. Well, as a graduate student, I decided to focus on the forest canopy, the treetops, the world above the forest floor. It was a very poorly known part of the forest ecosystem. It was called the last biotic frontier. But over the last 40 years, canopy scientists such as myself have sort of come up with a lot of different ways to get up there safely and non-destructively using mountain climbing techniques, canopy cranes, hot air balloons, canopy walkways, and most recently drones. And of all the many organisms that could be studied in the forest canopy, I got most excited about the plants that live in the forest canopy, the so-called epiphytes. Epi meaning upon and phyte meaning plants. There are as many as 25,000 different species of plants, vascular and non-vascular, that live in the forest canopy, getting their nutrients not from the host trees. They have no roots that go into the branches or trunks, nor from the forest floor, but rather they get their water and nutrients from outside the ecosystem because they have evolved many ways of intercepting and retaining nutrients that come in the form of mist and rain droplets. So they're a really intriguing part of the forest canopy, and my interest was trying to understand how that part of the ecosystem, very small relative to the biomass of the forest as a whole, might interact with the whole system. My students and I have also learned that they play important roles not only in nutrient and water cycling, but also in providing resources for birds and arboreal mammals and nesting materials for their habitat. Well, since we discovered that these canopy plants are so important in terms of so many ecosystem processes, I was really interested also in finding out what happens if you disturb them. And in 1987, shows you how old I am, I decided to start a series of experiments to physically and experimentally clear epiphytes from branches in multiple branches and multiple trees. And my prediction was that they would come back very rapidly because the canopy is such a lush, exuberant place, covered with every square centimeter with these epiphytic plants. And I also predicted that their returning plants would encroach from the side, like grass on a sidewalk. Well, I was wrong in both regards. First of all, it took 13 years before anything started coming back, which taught me that these are not resilient ecosystems. And instead of the growth coming back from encroachment on the side, they started encroaching from the bottom. Mosses and algae growing on the bottom of the wetter side of the branch, and then grew up and around until finally they coalesced on the top and continued regenerating. So I'd like to use this slide to demonstrate that once it's gone, and if you're really lucky, you might get some growth from the bottom coming around. But what was also interesting and very instructive in terms of looking at the effects of disturbance on recovery was that the plant communities that came back, even after 35 years, differed significantly from the original epiphytic community. And so that was also very instructive to me, and it made me think about not only disturbances in the forest canopy at the branch level, but disturbances that are going on in tropical rainforests all over the world. And this was the early 1990s. We were getting sort of aware of the problems of deforestation and of forest fragmentation. For example, in Monteverde, Costa Rica, where I do my work, we often see these what we call relic trees that are left in pastures by farmers when they clear out primary forest. So these trees grew up in the original rainforest, but they are persisting in pastures. And my question was, what might be the effect of isolation on these trees in terms of their canopy plant communities and the host trees themselves? Well, I tried to get funding from the National Science Foundation to investigate this very question, but I was told by the reviewers that although this is an interesting question in Monteverde, Costa Rica, there's no ecological theory about relic structures in any kind of in forest ecosystems. And so whatever I learned about Monteverde relic trees might not be generalizable into other places. And so I began thinking about how I could overcome this inability to do research on these relic trees that I was so interested in. And I realized that the disturbance in a forest ecosystem might be analogous to disturbances in other systems. For example, a disturbed patch of skin in a forest of healthy skin, like you see here, might have some insights. We might have some insights, either theory or tools or practices that burn trauma experts might be able to provide a forest ecologist like myself. And so I began thinking about ways I could draw in other disciplines to have them share their theories, their practices, and their tools to help me understand the effects of disturbance in my forest ecosystems. And at University of Utah, we have this fantastic feature on our website called find a researcher. Maybe you have it here at Texas A&M. So I typed in the keywords disturbance recovery, and I came up with a number of faculty members who study disturbance and recovery in a broad range of academic disciplines. And I decided to pull them together for a monthly colloquium where we could jointly discuss the processes of disturbance and recovery from the lenses of their disciplines together. So these are the representatives of these disciplines came together. We met for once a month for 2 hours a month in the faculty library, and we discussed disturbance and recovery. During the first semester, each faculty member presented how his or her field goes about studying recovery after disturbance. And during the second semester, we began putting these ideas and precepts together. And so after the end of the second semester, we came up with a number of what we called emerging precepts about how recovery occurs that drew from all of our different disciplines. And I'd like to share just 3 of those precepts with you this afternoon. First, we realized that we should seek knowledge from multiple sources, from diverse sources. So for example, in traffic engineering, our traffic engineer guy said that they get information from theoretical physics, from flow theory. They measure individual cars, they use cell phone data. All of these create giant data sets from which they can understand and mitigate the negative effects of disturbances, which is, in the case of traffic, are of course our traffic jams. And so when I began thinking about how to apply that to my work with relic trees and tropical pastures, I realized that I needed to seek knowledge from diverse sources, not just the scientific literature and scientific journals as I had been, but rather to talk to the farmers themselves. What prompts them to leave trees and pastures? Which trees do they use? And talking to women who use the medicinal plants that are left in relic trees for medicine. So that helped me better understand, more holistically understand what was going on with relic trees and pastures. A second precept was to extend and strengthen the web of relationships. And our faculty in human development said that, who studies attachment theory, that is, what happens when a small child or an infant loses a parent from death or divorce, very often in future years, that child does not know, and that adult does not know how to form trusting relationships. But what our development officer, or faculty member said was that if you can extend the web of relationships of that family to bring in another fatherly figure, like an uncle or a grandfather, you can mitigate the negative effects of that disturbance on that child. And so I began thinking about what are the relationships that need to be extended for these relic trees. The fact that we need to know whether or not certain pollinators or fruit dispersers have the capacity to cross that ocean of pasture to get to these relic trees in order to pollinate and disperse the fruits of those relic trees. And these trees can then serve as what we call regeneration nuclei for the rest of the forest and the recovering pasture. A third idea was that we need to recognize the broad spectrum of the consequences of disturbance. So for example, our refugee studies faculty member said, well, yes, we acknowledge that when we get displaced populations, there's negative effects of loss of place and loss of home. But in some cases, when we have refugees, for example, the young women from South Sudan who come to Salt Lake City actually have gained the ability to get education, something that they could not have done in their homeland. And in fact, disturbance can be generative. An amazing insight came from our modern dance participant who said, well, I don't know why you guys are talking about disturbance as being a negative thing, because for artists, disturbance is absolutely necessary to generate new art forms. And she said, if it weren't for disturbance, I, as a modern dancer, would still be doing ballet. And so she called disturbance a portal to the new. And that led all of us to our most profound realization of the colloquium, which was that we tend to assume that a system, whether it's a forest ecosystem or a human body, tends to start out in an original state, a disturbance happens, and then, if it's successful, so to speak, it returns to its original state. But actually, what we began realizing as we looked at our own field is that this hardly ever happens, if ever. That instead, you have an original state, a disturbance, and it doesn't go back to its original state, but rather it achieves what we began calling a third state. Neither the original nor disturbed, but something different. And subsequent disturbances will result in a fourth and a fifth state, and so on. So for example, our urban planner talked about the effects of Hurricane Katrina on New Orleans. And she gave us some pictures where she said, number one is the original New Orleans, number two is the disturbed state, and number three is New Orleans 3 years later. Some neighborhoods have actually improved in terms of their infrastructure, and some neighborhoods like the 9th Ward, for example, have continued to decline. But it's a different New Orleans than it was originally or in its disturbed state. And that takes us back to what I found out in the canopy 30 years ago, which is that, in fact, these disturbed epiphyte communities do not return to their original state, but they're not disturbed either. They're in a third state. And so this really led us to thinking about what we had accomplished in our colloquium, and we sort of made this little model where we saw that we could pose a theme or a question. We could gather likely participants who would have some stake in understanding this problem or helping to solve it. We implemented the colloquium. We produced papers and proposals and teaching from that. We then wanted to evaluate and modify it for other outcomes and other themes. Then we disseminated it, as I'm doing here today. And finally, that would lead to another cycle of that with another problem or another question. And what was, I think, really interesting to us is that, in a way, our colloquium itself was a disturbance. Just like this laser colloquium can serve as a disturbance to sort of shake up and provide an interruption in the typical siloed traditional way of approaching problems from a single discipline. And so what we realized that just as we began linking the different places, the different buildings on campus that house our different disciplines, we now have ways of communicating with other colloquium members and their colleagues to think about solving problems collectively and interdisciplinarily. For example, the traffic engineer and I have now put together an interdisciplinary proposal to the National Science Foundation to look at the flow of birds from outside the forest, outside the pasture, into pasture trees, using some of the tools and models that the traffic engineer uses to measure flow between one place to another. So what I'd like to do now, having sort of exposed you to some of the evolution of thinking from working in the canopy and with nature, and then subsequently with this wonderful group of interdisciplinary colleagues who have tried to tackle collectively understanding the effects of disturbance and recovery, is to think about ways that we can actually apply them. And I'm going to share with you a sort of a personal disturbance that I encountered that I used these precepts to help myself recover. I was doing a study of the effects of disturbances on moss communities in the temperate rainforests on the Olympic Peninsula of Western Washington in 2015. I went out there with my students. We started climbing trees to collect moss samples, and suddenly I felt no tension in the rope that I was on, sitting in the forest canopy. And as I leaned over the branch, you'd think that I would have hit some of the intervening branches, but instead my students later said that I fell like a silent sack of sand 60 feet below to the forest floor. Well, I ended up with life-threatening injuries. I was medevaced out of there to the Harborview Medical Center in Seattle. I had 5 exploded vertebrae. I broke my pelvis in 3 parts. I had 9 broken ribs. I lacerated my left lung. I broke my fibula and had 9 broken ribs and suffered traumatic brain injury. So that was a big disturbance in my life, as you might understand. And I was filled with fear, not only about my recovery, but really about kind of who I would be after I recovered to some extent from that disturbance. But I realized then that I might be able to apply some of the precepts that I had just learned from this colloquium that ended 2 weeks before I fell out of that tree. So I realized I need to get information from diverse sources. So I was able to think about getting information not only from the doctors and nurses about my injuries, which was the traditional way of getting information, but also I began talking to the roommates that I encountered who had suffered not the same kinds of injuries of me, but were going through similar sort of emotional questions about what they were going to be after they recovered. I also found myself asking questions and getting information from nature outside my window and realizing how important it was to me to try as hard as I could to recover so that I could go back out into the forest for work and for recreation. I knew that it was important to enhance and sustain my web of relationships. And this was true not only with my family and friends who gathered around me, but also I realized it was important for me to establish relationships with the people who were going to physical therapy with me, because they were going through some of the same things that I was going through. I realized I needed a support group, and so I went and followed up with a support group of people who had suffered physical trauma in my community. And again, I sought connections and included in my web of relationships the nature that I saw and was able to encounter in slow pieces as I recovered to go outside. And third, I had to recognize that there would be a range, a spectrum of consequences from my recovery. I really didn't know who I would turn into being. I knew who I was. I was a mom, I was an academic, I was a bike racer, I was a forest ecologist, I was a public speaker, I was a bringer of science lectures to people who are incarcerated, I was a winner of honorary degrees, but what would I be in my third state, in my own third state? Well, I found myself choosing to take time to do other things in addition to science. I was still very interested in doing science, and I could continue to do that, but I found myself taking time to learn new things, like making wooden bowls by doing wood turning, and it gave me enormous pleasure because I was working with my hands instead of just my brain, and I was learning about trees and forests through a different medium, through the grain of the wood and the smell of the sawdust. My husband and I began a tradition called Monday Home Evening, in which we invite 25 or 30 people over to dinner, 30 people at a time every single Monday, and I cook all the food for that, and we have these wonderful dinners of fellowship and community. I'm now a grandmother, and I take time to hang out with my 3-year-old and 1-year-old granddaughters. And so those were different activities that I began taking on, but I think the main one was my whole attitude about what I should be doing in the world. Because before my fall, I was continually sort of riding what I think of as a bright red arrow of my ambition to succeed, to be valued, to be loved. That's what I associated success with. But I realized that after my recovery, or during my recovery, when I was so incapacitated, what I learned was that people actually loved me for me, and they didn't really care if I ever wrote another proposal or got another paper published, that they just wanted me to enter whatever third state I might be capable of doing. And so with that, I've become more aware of the importance of not only studying trees, but also coming to terms with the fact that many people on our planet are now isolated from nature. And I began thinking about how I might use this greater awareness, this greater sensitivity to disturbance that came from my own fall, my own disturbance, to carry out activities that would have meaning for me, not just to forests, but also to people. So I began designing and thinking about ways that I could make people more aware of the importance of trees, and I started doing this in sort of traditional ways by giving talks in museums and being in National Geographic videos and writing natural history articles. But I soon realized that the people who watch those films and the people who read those articles and the people who go to natural history museums already know how great trees are. And so I began thinking that I needed to disturb the way that I carried out science communication and public engagement. And the way I began doing that was thinking first about, what is it that I'm not interested in? Because if I'm asking somebody who's not interested in trees to get interested in trees, I had to think about, well, what is it that I'm not interested in, and how could I get interested in that? And so one thing I'm not interested in is professional sports. I mean, nothing against all of your teams here in Aggie Land, but I really don't care, like, who wins the World Series. And so that happened until somebody said, well, Nalini, all the baseball bats in the American League and the National League are made of wood. And I went, wood? Trees? Now I'm interested in baseball, because, like, is it birch? Is it cherry? Is it maple? Is it ash? What kind of trees are used to make those baseball bats? And so I realized that if I could find some sort of connection, to this thing I'm not interested in that's of interest to me, I might be able to become interested in that entity as well. And I began thinking that my own interest in trees began when I was a little girl climbing trees in my parents' front yard. And I began thinking about how can I get little girls who are interested, who live in cities like New York City or Nairobi or Tokyo, who don't have trees to climb, how could I get them interested in trees? And I thought, well, of course, Barbie, pretty much every little girl loves Barbie. And so I approached Mattel, who makes Barbie, with the idea of making a treetop Barbie. And back in 2004, they said, no, we're not interested. So my students and I made our own treetop Barbies. We bought used Barbies. We got volunteer seamstresses to make little outfits and little helmets we bought on eBay. We made a little booklet that goes along with Barbie that we would send out that has, information about mosses that grow in the forest canopy. But amazingly, it was a very small scale. Because I sold them on my website, like who goes to an academic website. But anyway, it turned out in 2021, Mattel and National Geographic partnered to make a set of Explorer Barbies, and they asked me to be an advisor on it. And as a thank you, they made a one-of-a-kind Nalini look-alike treetop Barbie, which I now have in my lab. So that was a way I realized that I could connect something that little girls love to what I find important, which is trees and forests, connect those two in order to promote a greater awareness of the importance of trees and of women who might climb into the forest canopy to study them. Many people are religious in our world. Over 80% of people on our planet are self-acclaimed people who believe in God or have some religious feelings. There's often a conflict between science and religion. This whole creationism versus evolution debates are very contentious. And so I decided to do public engagement with people who are religious, was not to shove science down their throats by quoting scientific articles, but instead reading their Bible, their Quran, their Talmud, their Buddhist tales, and extract all of the verses that have to do with trees and forests, from which then I put together a sermon called Trees and Spirituality. And I started knocking on doors of churches and synagogues and offering this sermon about trees and spirituality to the congregants. We've also created, that was very successful. There was never a conflict between science and religion because I was relying on their authorities to carry out this understanding of how people view trees and what their values are. We also started mapping trees in churchyards and providing information about those trees, both scriptural information as well as scientific information. Well, as you guys know, the arts are another area of incredibly important power in terms of both understanding and perception and communication. And so I started some work supported by the National Geographic Society to carry out what I call canopy confluences, where I brought together forest ecologists with visual artists, with poets, with creative writers, with rap singers, with opera singers, with modern dancers. We spent a week at a time in the forest canopy. I taught them all how to climb trees. We sat on platforms in the forest canopy, and every evening we would have a campfire and talk about what we had perceived and how we might communicate it to different artistic audiences. So some of the outcomes were just amazing pieces of installation art. This is by Bruce Chow at RISD, the Rhode Island School of Design. A modern dance by Jody Lomask and her company called Capacitor in San Francisco, which we performed in San Francisco and Seattle. We brought musicians into the canopy, traditional musicians as well as a rap singer, one of my students named Duke Brady. He made this fabulous canopy rap song, and I realized that was a real attraction to people who, especially young people who live in urban places, who might not appreciate the ecological values of trees, but might appreciate the rap song values. And so we started a summer program called Sound Science, where we brought a professional rap singer together with 40 at-risk kids from Tacoma, Washington. They went out to the forest in the morning, and in the afternoon, they made their own rap songs and hip-hop songs and spoken word poetry, created a CD, which they brought back to their family and friends. So it was using the power of the arts to perceive and communicate the values of trees and forests. The final sector that I've worked with most extensively actually is with people who are incarcerated, because this is the built environment that is the most nature deficit of any that I can really think of on Earth. And in 2004, I started a program to bring in science lectures and also conservation projects to engage with the men and women who are incarcerated in state prisons in Washington State and Utah. They raised the endangered species such as the Oregon spotted frog, the Taylor checker spot butterfly. They grew 19 species of endangered prairie plants, and these organisms were then outplanted to protected area on the outside, giving the people who are incarcerated a true sense of contribution to helping the planet Earth. Well, we were really happy about this. What I realized was that, of course, working with the general population of people who are incarcerated, I was missing those parts of our system of mass incarceration that are the most deeply embedded and the least able to contact nature. And that is the cell blocks of solitary confinement parts of our system of mass incarceration. We could not bring plants and frogs and butterflies to those places because of the high security levels, but we could bring videos of nature, which we did in a supermax prison in Oregon. This was a cell block that was divided in two parts. One half of the men were able to watch nature videos in their exercise rooms. The other half did not watch videos. And after a year of watching these videos for just 1 hour a day, the men on the side that watched videos committed 26% fewer violent infractions. And we attribute that to the calming nature of exposure to nature. Now we know that these kinds of programs do not solve the embedded injustices of our system of mass incarceration, but it is something that a biologist like me or like artists and video people like you can do in terms of shifting us from the side of despair to hope. And so I think that the generative power of disturbance has really led me to understand that it is very possible to weave together the ecological values of trees and forests with these other values of recreation, of spirituality, of arts, and of social justice. And I also think that there are many, many other threads from many, many other disciplines that could be woven into this tapestry of understanding and of care for our planet. And I'd just like to mention one of these threads that I'm working on now. I'm remembering about how important even a view of nature was when I was isolated in the solitary confinement, in the ICU following my disturbance. And so one of the things that I'm working with now is collaborating with the Society for Critical Care of Medicine to try to make ICU units more nature-centric. And one of the ways I'm doing that is to weave in the power of fashion, the power of clothing, the power of images into the ICU by putting nature images on scrubs and gowns so that when people walk through or act through the natural history or the ICU, they can at least get an image of nature that might help to reduce their stress and anxiety. So I think as I move forward, and perhaps as all of you move forward into this set of journeys of moving from disciplinarity to interdisciplinarity, you'll think about who should be sitting at that loom. Whose threads will you include in the image that might result in a tapestry that is complex and that is connected, that is useful, that is strong, and that is beautiful. And I think in doing so, as we continue to experience disturbances, as we will, and as we continue to walk this knife edge between despair and hope, we can draw upon the wisdom that emerges by crossing disciplines and move ourselves from despair to hope. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Join us here and for some questions. And would you like some water, Nalini?
No, I'm good, thanks.
Okay, here, this is
great.
We'll put you in the middle.
Okay.
Okay, well, to get started, first we always like to open it up to our audience and see if there are any questions that you all have. Yes, we have a question.
So, you want to come up?
I can hear you actually well, so I was going to see that.
A lot of the things you just talked about, like the natural prints on strobe design, is like a very innovative solution to bring more nature into hostel rooms. How do you daily foster creativity and like open your mind to explore new ideas in like so many different ways? Like, is there practices you do every day that allow you to be more creative?
Ooh, that's a great question.
Yeah, you want to repeat, summarize it?
Yeah, so he was wondering about...
Oh, what is your name? Your first name? Leopold, thank you.
On a personal level, do you have daily creativity practices or daily inspirational practices? And it was actually similar to something I was going to ask you, because it just seems that your tentacles go so far. Do you spend time fostering those, or do you go where the next idea, how does it unfold for you?
So like, what is the process of doing all these weird things?
Yeah, so just like come to you, or do you nurture the path?
You know, that's a great question, Leopold, and I've often asked myself that. I think, you know, one of the things I didn't cover was my own background. My dad, I had a very interdisciplinary personal background. My dad was from India. He was a Hindu. He was a scientist. He worked for the National Institutes of Health. My mother is the daughter of Russian immigrants. She was an Orthodox Jew. She studied languages and communication. And so I think, you know, my 5 siblings and I, from the get-go, from the day of our birth, were always exposed to this, you know, this diversity of culture, of cooking, of ideas, of religion, of practices, and we never saw a conflict. I mean, I think that's a gift that my parents gave me, which was, and my siblings, which is, you know, Hinduism and Judaism, they seem so different, but actually at the basis, they are the same. The values of religion are the same in every religion. Honor your parents, contribute to the world, celebrate some kind of ritual and celebration. And so I think what I learned from my parents and my upbringing is that at the base of everything, it's the same. You know, science and the arts, as you know, share so many things. We're creative, we rely on process, we want to share our work with others, we want to get critical input. There's a joy that comes from the work of doing science and art. And so I think that's really the impetus of what I've been able to do. So I don't have a daily practice to say like, boy, it's 9 o'clock and I haven't had a new idea yet. I better sit down and meditate and get a new idea. It just seems so natural to me. And I know that's not very useful to other people, but I think a big part of what comes out of thinking like this and working with others like this is the fact that sometimes we need permission to do this. And I can tell you, I observed this at the colloquium when all of us 10 people, faculty members, who had very, very different traditions and cultures in their own departments and their own labs, they needed permission from me to say, it's okay for you to listen to you traffic engineer, to listen to a modern dancer. She's not better or worse than you are. We are all seeking to understand diversity or disturbance, and that's why I had it, I put the colloquium in the library. It was neutral ground because it wasn't a science lab or a dance studio. It was neutral ground for all of us. And it took some weeks for us to understand that engineers and dancers, that human development people and people who study refugee studies and people who study burn trauma in hospitals all can have ideas that are all shareable and may be useful to each other. But it really took that intentional permission giving for people to sort of let go, that they didn't have to follow some academic hierarchy, and that they didn't have, and that's what I learned in the Confluence too. Like some of the dancers started moss collections. And some of the moss collectors started making charcoal drawings of mosses. And so if we gave them permission, as I did to give them permission, that unleashed what was already inside of them that might have been suppressed because of fears or insecurities or something that they had been told that they weren't supposed to do.
Carrying along those lines, and we've been talking about the growing pains of some of the things and evolving in that way from disturbances. What recommendations do you have for perhaps when you encounter or how to develop that freedom or to allow others to have that? Do you have any best practices for how to nurture that in others, particularly if you maybe see resistance?
Yeah.
Or maybe a better question is, how do you handle resistance?
Yeah.
Because certainly you have encountered that
Right.
with people and with these kinds of
Sure.
developments. So what advice
Right.
do you have there?
I think the advice is to be proactive about that so that you don't encounter resistance. What you have to do is think very proactively and carefully about what does the other side, the other discipline, or the other societal sector value? And how can I align what I do with the value system of that other sector? So for example, when I first started thinking about bringing nature videos to solitary confinement cell blocks, I approached the warden of the prison by saying, oh, this will make your men feel much better. This will make them feel calmer. This will connect them with nature. And of course the warden said, well, that's not my job. That is not my job. That is your job. That is your job as a nature tree lover. But that's not my job. My boss, the state legislature, doesn't care about whether these men feel good or not. In fact, the officers who are looking after them call them animals, and they don't want them to have a better time in prison because they're supposed to be getting punished. So that's when I realized I had to think into the mind of the prison warden and think about what he or she values. And one of the things they value is reduced recidivism, that these men won't come back. Number two, that they will not have as many violent infractions, because that very often injures a guard, and as well as the prisoner, which means they have to be taken to the hospital at great expense and with great trouble. So I had to gather evidence that showed that when you expose people to nature, it brings down stress and anxiety and aggression. And when I could then frame what I was doing as, this is a way to reduce the number of violent infractions, at least we have evidence of that. We don't have any from other fields, but we don't know whether that would work in your solitary confinement cell blocks. How about we try it?
Yeah.
And you, warden, could be the guy who provides something very simple and low cost for bringing down violent infractions. Well, that's exactly what happened, and Time magazine called our idea, we were named one of the 25 best ideas of 2014, and the warden got the credit for that, which was fabulous. So suddenly, there was no resistance on the part of the warden, because I learned through making mistakes in how I framed and presented it, that in fact, if I could think more carefully and with intellectual humility about what he or she values instead of only what I value, I have a better chance of reducing the resistance that will be encountered when I enter into one of these different worlds.
I love that intellectual humility,
Yeah.
approaching conversations, approaching spaces with that. That's beautiful.
And let me just say one other
Yeah.
quick thing, which is just because you're intellectually humble and you can bring down your sense of, like Barbie, I hate Barbies, I hate what they represent, but I knew the power of Barbie. It doesn't mean I have to become a Barbie advocate. And if I'm not a religious person, it doesn't mean I have to become a Presbyterian or a Jew or a Catholic in order to interact positively with a congregation. It just means I have to be intellectually humble in the way I go about approaching and engaging with them. But it doesn't mean you have to go across the line and become one of them.
Right,
And that's a really important distinction, I think.
Yes, thank you for that. Waryoung, do you, yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing your life and all the works. Actually before this talk, I was a little tired, but I think, your talk just made me so refreshed and energized again, actually interested in so many different things too. The questions I wanted to ask, people already asked, but I would like to ask you if you have any suggestions or recommendations for educators who, raise students.
Yes.
who need to live in this kind, like a new world, should be interdisciplinary, should be open-minded, should be able to work with other people. Do you have any recommendations and suggestions for educators?
Yeah, I think the same recommendations, which is that we all who have been in the classroom recognize that our students learn in different ways. Some are audio learning, some are visual, some are experiential learners, and we tend to have this one way of teaching. Like I stand up in front of them, I lecture them for 50 minutes, I test them in certain ways. So I think if we can, again, and because I learned that way, that's, the school system suited me just fine because I happen to be able to learn that way. But if I can be, again, intellectually humble and realize and recognize which students might need a different kind of input, a different kind of reward, a different way of engaging and exchanging information, that might be a good first step. Not that we're so constrained by class sizes and so forth and the amount of time we have on our students, we can't accommodate everybody in a perfect way. But I think just recognizing that, I think, is a big step in terms of engaging with as many students as deeply as we possibly can. I think that we can also help students, as you mentioned, in this changing world. Our world, and I'm way older than you guys are, but even you guys have seen changes in the intellectual basis of our fields since we left school, that again, it's this disturbance and recovery thing. It's the way of learning, the content of what we learn, the way that we engage with those facts and figures and understanding has been disturbed multiple times and will continue to be disturbed. So how are we to respond to that? Well, first we say, get information from a diversity of sources. So learn about different ways of teaching. Reach out to the web of relationships. Maybe students can relate to each other and make a web of relationships and study groups themselves. And be aware that there's going to be a spectrum of responses. For some students, a disturbance in a way of learning, like introduction of social media or something, will be very positive, and for others it might be negative. So I think those precepts really resonate in a very general way, not to just our colleagues or our administrators, but also to our students.
That's great. Thank you so much. Maybe one more question. You already, worked on so many different work projects and worked with a lot of other people in different disciplines. I was wondering, do you have any other future works you're thinking of?
Yes, and actually I think there might be some connection with all of you, especially in the arts. One of the things is this fashion idea, and that's sort of cooking. But another thing is, when I retired from my active faculty position in 2021 from the biology department, I made a connection with a group called the Sorensen Impact Institute, which is at the University of Utah, which is in the College of Business. And they are working to grow the impact investor ecosystem. So impact investors are investors of money, and also very usually large chunks of money, that do some kind of social or ecological good, but still have some kind of financial return. And usually that financial return can be a smaller percentage than, say, like a venture capitalist investment, and the time frame for getting that return can be longer than a typical investment. But and most of these investors are younger people who want to really see their money do good. And when I learned about this, I thought, wow, that's amazing. Because as an ecologist and someone who works with ecological restoration and something, I get money from the National Science Foundation for 2 years, 3 years, maybe 4 years at most. And even if I go to a foundation, it's always short term, 2 years, 3 years, and then they're off to the next shiny thing. So I thought, wow, what if impact investors, what if I could provide them with more information about ecological projects, programs, and people who are working on long-term projects to get them interested in impact investing for those projects. And especially with forest ecosystems, which is what I work on, there's a long-term sort of time frame in terms of return. So I joined this Sorensen Impact Institute as a research fellow in residence, and now I'm working with them to work on what are called nature-based solutions, projects involved with carbon sequestration, projects involved with biodiversity credits, ecosystem services. And as I began working with them, I realized, as many people do, that when you monetize nature through carbon credits, biodiversity credits, or ecosystem services, that's part of the value of nature. But there's another big part of nature that is not monetizable, what we call the intangible benefits of nature: aesthetic values, spiritual and religious values, cultural values, human well-being values, and nobody has been able to put a dollar value on that. So now that I'm involved with this Impact Institute, I'm trying to figure out ways that we could convene those impact investors with people like you guys who are deeply involved with the aesthetics and art and communication, to help us come up with ways that we could, if not monetize with a dollar value, put some kind of recognition of these other intangible values on nature. And I think there are a number of you who are, like, where's the ice? Yeah, who's working with the interface between climate change and objects that you could see in a gallery or experience in some sort of installation that would move people. So you're kind of getting inspired by nature and its beauty and its importance, but you're expressing it in a really different way than how many gallons of water are purified when a forest roots go through the soil. And so we don't know how to calculate that, and we need to understand that. Not that you have the answer of how to do that, but you could bring to the table a lot more than what these impact investors, or even ecologists like me, could bring to that table to understand it. Because I think humans have traditionally, in the economic realm, have traditionally undervalued nature, using the currency that Western people do. Not that it's been undervalued by indigenous groups or other groups, but definitely in our Western system, We have not calculated the vast value that nature has. And if we could figure out how to do that, we might have a better chance of saving it and augmenting it and allowing it to flourish.
Do we have any other questions from the audience? We have a few more minutes. Yes, Joel.
Did you end up engaging the baseball community?
The baseball. Did you get involved with the
And my
baseball
thought is
community?
baseball cards. You know, I hit for trees. I'm batting 1,000 because of trees. And if anybody has a connection to maybe here in this Aggie place, you guys could hook me up with somebody who's actually responsible for media for baseball players, because it is, I think it's a miracle that you know, that trees play a big important role in professional baseball, but also for other sports as well. You know, basketball floors are made of sugar maple and hard maple. So where would the Celtics?
Yes.
Where would the Celtics be without maple trees?
I know.
They are a team, sorry.
Oh, okay. What's the
It's not his favorite team.
I appreciate that all these projects need to have that, you're looking for that successful transformation in the audience. Were you able to do that with the religious audience? I mean, I presume with a lot of these you're searching for that data to prove that the way you did it with prisons, that's obviously an academic structure.
Yeah.
Well, as it is with all of us trying to execute some sort of tangible outcome. How do you go with it?
Yeah, that's a great, you know, one of the difficult things about this project, as with many projects, is it's difficult to assess impact. You could say, oh, well, there were 40 people in the church that I talked to, and I talked to 300 churches, so that's 40 times 300. But there were some, anecdotally, some really interesting things that came out that I think did have impact. So I gave one of these sermons in a Baptist church in Olympia, Washington, and one of them came up to me and said, this man came up and said, Dr. Nadkarni, could I get your email? And I thought, oh no, now he's going to proselytize me to become a Baptist. But I said, no, you know, you don't, I'm a Hindu Jew, like forget it, I'm not going to become a Baptist. He said, no. We organized a tree planting event in our churchyard, and we were wondering whether you and your students would like to join us. And so it made me realize that I had, again, intellectually unhumble, I had made an assumption about how he was approaching me, whereas in fact he was already on board with planting trees. The other thing that happened is that, you know, I've been doing this religious science connection for almost 20 years now, and I've made connections with many churches, with many church people. I've given lectures in seminaries. I made those, you know, those little booklets, and that has led me to be able to have conversations with major religious leaders, like the Archbishop of Canterbury, who's sort of the Episcopalian Pope. And he's the religious leader of 38 million Episcopalians and Anglicans. And he was curious about the topic of ecological justice. What is that? He wanted to know. And so the head of the Virginia Theological Seminary had his ear and listened to his curiosity. Because I had given a talk at the Theological Seminary, he linked me up with the Archbishop of Canterbury, and we were able to have this wonderful conversation about the importance of ecological justice, which was, from his standpoint, this religious aspect of doing good in the world, of being a good Anglican. From my standpoint, it was about ecological justice that has to be done in terms of the social and ecological impacts of things like where do factories and pulp mills get placed. But it was an exchange at a very high level that he could actually take that information about ecological justice and spread that to his followers, which is something, you know, I couldn't do going church by church. But by building up that trust, by building up over years, this set of relationships, this web of relationships between me as a scientist and religious communities all over the place, it led me to that point where I could have a conversation and an exchange and a sense of positive engagement with somebody who could maybe make a difference in the way ecological justice happens.
Thanks, so inspiring, thank you. Any last questions? Courtney, yeah.
It's a big one.
Perfect to end on.
So, in my practice, I struggle with like finding the right balance of kind of that aesthetic allure and kind of an object that will draw people in, but then have kind of some resonance or lasting impact that then the goal is leads to action in providing that, okay, so it's not just about the distress and paralysis and like we're doing stuff about like climate anxiety and the paralysis and just that
despair, right?
But then and it is this like I love this slide of this nice set because you kind of try to figure out where the work sits in that and also doesn't like turn people off to be like what I have the hope I trust that other people will solve the problem and then get that in. I'm wondering if you have any advice artists about how to provide a call to action but not have it beat people in the head or feel overwhelming in that to make the work even more effective. We also struggle to measure the impact of our actions.
That is a really great question, and I think all of us think about it, and I guess I will say don't worry about it. And I say that because what I've come to understand from my own worry that I'm not doing enough, that I go church by church, I go prison by prison. There are 2.3 million people who are incarcerated in our country. There are 50,000 youth who are in juvenile detention centers. And I've worked in maybe 40 or 50 prisons with these conservation projects and science lectures. So it's a tiny drop in the bucket. And I don't know what the impact will be. We do surveys of these inmates, but we never know what the long-term effect is of that. And so the way I've come to peace with that is to understand that when we do any action, small as it may seem, it might have impact. And I did some math, and this is for scientists, but probably relates to artists. There are 6.2 million scientists in our country. There are 325 million people in our country. If every scientist had a conversation and engaged with just 52 people a year, this is the math, that's one person a week, talking about the effects of shade-grown coffee, and on bird diversity, or the need for electric vehicles with an Uber driver, then we will have talked to every single person in the country about something that has to do with connecting people and nature. So if you talk to your barista once a week about shade-grown coffee, or your Uber driver once a week, check, you've done it. And so if, again, going back to your example of people seeing your artwork at a small exhibit like this faculty exhibit here, well, if 20 people see this a day and they go and they talk to one person a week, they will know, many people will know that there's this faculty biennial show that has some amazing artwork in it, and other people then might be moved to see it. And it goes back to that third precept that we do not know the consequences of this broad spectrum of consequences of disturbance. And so your piece of art is a disturbance. It's going to disturb people in some way. And I've tried to convince you that disturbance is not necessarily negative. It's a generative power of disturbance. So you don't have control over what that spectrum of responses is going to be. All you can do as an artist, all I can do as a dedicated scientist, can offer what we have and call it as good enough. And I think there are positive things that come out of it. The Baptist who's doing the tree planting, the inmates who write to us and say, thank you for letting me contribute to the earth. There's some evidence there that it's positive. We know, again, we can't fall on the side of hope that that's going to fix the world and all of its problems, but I think we can go to bed at night and we can return to our students during the day and saying, I want to train you to do this work because I think that it's important. In fact, I know that it's important.
That was a perfect ending. So with that, we do want the conversation to continue, and it was just incredibly inspiring. We will be milling about a bit. There are snacks. Please feel free to enjoy it. This has been a magical time together.
Thanks, Lynn.
Thank you, Dr. Nadkarni, for everything, and thank you for everyone to be here. Thank you.